Here, let me take that heavy one for you.
That's so sweet of you. Thank you.
The fastest way to learn who someone really is to watch how they treat a person who cannot fight back. The words would not be spoken until much later, but the lesson began on a busy Friday evening inside one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished marble floors. Soft piano music drifted through the dining room, while wealthy guests enjoyed expensive meals beneath warm golden light. At the center of the room sat Victor Caldwell, a billionaire known for building a business empire from nothing and demanding perfection from everyone around him. People listened when he spoke. Employees moved carefully when he entered a room. His reputation alone could change careers. Across the dining room, Danielle Brooks balanced a silver tray while navigating between crowded tables. At 31 years old, she had spent years working in restaurants. She knew how to remain calm under pressure. She knew how to smile through long shifts and difficult customers. Most importantly, she understood that one mistake in a luxury restaurant could feel much larger than it really was. The evening had been unusually busy. A major charity event had brought business leaders, investors, and public figures into the restaurant. Every table seemed occupied. Every employee was moving at full speed. Danielle had already worked several extra hours that week, yet she remained focused on serving each guest with patience and professionalism. As she approached Victor's table carrying sparkling water, a nearby customer unexpectedly pushed back a chair. Danielle adjusted her path immediately. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it shifted her balance just enough. A few drops of water splashed from the bottle. Most landed harmlessly on the tablecloth. A tiny amount touched the corner of a document folder resting beside Victor's hand. Danielle froze. The room itself did not react. In most situations, nobody would have noticed. But Victor noticed. He stared at the folder before slowly lifting his eyes toward Danielle. The conversation at his table stopped. Danielle immediately reached for a clean cloth. "I am very sorry, sir," she said. "Let me take care of that right away." The moisture barely marked the edge of the folder. Within seconds, it could have been wiped away completely. Yet Victor's expression darkened. He stood from his chair. The movement alone attracted attention from nearby tables. Conversations began fading as people sensed tension. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Victor asked sharply, holding up the folder. Danielle remained respectful. "I apologize. It was an accident." Victor shook his head. An accident caused by carelessness. Several guests turned to watch. Employees near the service station exchanged worried looks. Danielle felt dozens of eyes settling on her, but she kept her composure. The folder itself appeared undamaged. Everyone could see that. Yet Victor continued. "People stop paying attention to details, and then they wonder why they never move forward in life." The words landed harder than the mistake itself. Danielle lowered her gaze briefly before looking back up. Her voice remained calm. "I understand your frustration, sir." Victor laughed without humor. "No, I do not think you do." Around them, the beautiful restaurant suddenly felt much colder. And although Danielle did not know it yet, the next few minutes would change far more than her job. They would reveal the character of every person in the room. The silence spread farther through the dining room with each passing second. Victor Caldwell remained standing beside the table, his expensive document folder still in his hand. The tiny water spots had already begun drying, making the entire situation appear even smaller than it had moments earlier. Yet nobody seemed willing to point that out. Power had a way of changing how people interpreted events. Danielle Brooks could feel the eyes of guests, managers, and co-workers fixed upon her. Even so, she refused to let embarrassment control her expression. Years of working in customer service had taught her that dignity often revealed itself during uncomfortable moments. "I think we are finished here," Victor said coldly. His voice carried farther than he probably intended. Nearby conversations stopped completely. Danielle stood quietly, hands folded in front of her apron. She knew arguing would only make the situation worse. Across the room, Rachel Foster, the restaurant manager, hurried toward the table. Concern was written across her face. She had worked with Danielle for nearly 4 years and knew exactly what kind of employee she was. Reliable, honest, consistently kind. The type of person who stayed late when others needed help. The type of person who remembered customers' names and favorite meals. The type of employee every restaurant hoped to keep. Rachel approached carefully. Mr. Caldwell, I apologize for the inconvenience. We would be happy to replace anything necessary. Victor shook his head. This is not about replacing a document. He glanced toward Danielle again. It is about standards. Rachel remained professional. Danielle is one of our strongest employees. Victor's expression hardened. Then perhaps your standards are lower than I assumed. The comment landed heavily. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Danielle noticed the tension spreading through the room. More than anything, she wished the attention would disappear. She had never enjoyed being the center of a crowd. While Victor continued discussing professionalism, Danielle's mind briefly drifted somewhere else entirely. Earlier that morning, she had stopped by her mother's apartment before work. Her mother had smiled when Danielle brought groceries and helped organize medication for the week. They had shared coffee near the window while sunlight filled the small kitchen. Danielle remembered promising she would visit again the following evening. The memory steadied her. It reminded her that life existed beyond this restaurant and beyond this moment. Rachel lowered her voice. Mr. Caldwell, I assure you this was a simple accident. Victor answered immediately. Simple mistakes reveal larger problems. Danielle finally spoke. The responsibility is mine. Rachel turned toward her. Danielle offered a small reassuring smile. She did not want her manager fighting a battle that was already becoming impossible to win. Around the dining room, several employees watched from a distance. Some looked worried. Others looked frustrated. None seemed surprised that Danielle was handling the situation with grace. She always did. What few people knew was how many challenges she carried outside these walls. Double shifts, medical bills, long train rides, sleepless nights worrying about family. Yet she rarely complained. Instead, she focused on helping others. The irony was painful. A woman who spent much of her life showing patience was now being judged entirely by a mistake that lasted less than 5 seconds. Victor eventually sat back down, but the atmosphere remained tense. Rachel quietly asked Danielle to step away from the dining room for a few minutes. Danielle nodded and walked toward the service corridor. As she disappeared behind the swinging doors, whispers immediately began spreading among the guests. And for the first time that evening, people started asking a question Victor had not considered. Who was Danielle Brooks when nobody was watching? Behind the swinging doors of the service corridor, Danielle Brooks stood quietly beside a stainless steel counter while the noise of the dining room faded into the distance. She took a slow breath and adjusted her name tag. Her hands remained steady. That alone surprised one of the younger employees standing nearby. Most people would have been angry. Others would have been crying. Danielle simply looked thoughtful. Meanwhile, out in the dining room, Victor Caldwell returned to his seat as though the matter had already been settled. To him, the incident represented something larger than a few drops of water. Throughout his career, he had built an identity around discipline. Newspapers often described him as self-made. Business magazines celebrated his relentless standards. Employees at his companies knew his reputation well. Victor believed mistakes carried consequences. He believed accountability separated success from failure. And over time, that belief had hardened into something more rigid, something that left very little room for understanding. Across the table, one of his business associates shifted uncomfortably. It seemed like an honest accident, the man said carefully. Victor picked up his glass. Most failures begin with small accidents, people. Choose to excuse. The response immediately ended the conversation. Nobody wanted to challenge him further. For decades, Victor had been surrounded by people who admired his accomplishments. They listened when he spoke. They agreed when he judged. Eventually, agreement had become normal. The possibility that he might be wrong rarely entered the room. Back in the service area, Rachel Foster stepped beside Danielle. I am sorry, she said quietly. Danielle offered a small smile. You do not need to apologize. Rachel shook her head. You did not deserve that. Danielle glanced toward the dining room doors. Through a narrow window, she could see guests still watching the situation unfold. Sometimes people are carrying things we cannot see, she replied. Rachel studied her face. You are talking about him? Danielle nodded slightly. Maybe. Or maybe I am talking about everyone. The answer sounded exactly like something Danielle would say. She had always been unusually patient with people. Months earlier, A customer had spent nearly 20 minutes complaining about a delayed meal. Instead of arguing, Danielle had listened. By the end of the evening, the customer apologized. Another time, she had stayed after closing to help an elderly guest find a missing wallet. Small moments like that rarely attracted attention. Yet they happened constantly. The people who worked beside her knew it. What Victor did not know was that several employees in the restaurant had personally experienced Danielle's kindness during difficult periods in their lives. She never announced it. She never expected recognition. She simply helped when she could. Out in the dining room, whispers continued moving from table to table. Guests who had witnessed the confrontation began discussing it among themselves. Some felt sympathy for Danielle. Others wondered whether the reaction had been excessive. A few quietly questioned why such a minor mistake had become a public spectacle. The atmosphere of celebration that had filled the charity event earlier was slowly disappearing. In its place came something else. Reflection, curiosity, doubt. And as Victor sat beneath the glow of the chandeliers, confident that his judgment had been justified, he remained completely unaware that the people around him were beginning to see the situation through a very different lens. The service corridor felt unusually quiet compared to the elegant dining room beyond the swinging doors. Danielle Brooks sat alone for a moment on a small chair beside the employee lockers, listening to the distant sounds of silverware and conversation. She should have felt angry. She should have felt humiliated. Instead, she felt tired. Not because of what had happened at Victor Caldwell's table, but because life had already demanded so much strength from her long before this evening began. A few minutes later, Rachel Foster entered carrying a folder. The expression on her face told Danielle everything before a single word was spoken. Rachel closed the door behind her and lowered her eyes. "Victor is demanding immediate action," she said quietly. Danielle nodded. She had expected as much. Rachel sat beside her. "I tried to explain. I told him your record here has been exceptional." Danielle smiled gently. "Thank you." Rachel looked frustrated. "This is not right." Danielle remained calm. "Maybe not." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Outside, the charity event continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Guests were still discussing what had happened. Some had witnessed the entire incident. Others had only heard pieces of it. Yet nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The reaction seemed far larger than the mistake itself. Back in the dining room, Victor continued speaking with business associates. Yet his attention kept drifting toward the service corridor. To him, the issue had become a matter of principle. He had spent decades believing that standards defined success. In his mind, allowing mistakes to pass without consequence weakened accountability. What he could not see was how much of his thinking had become disconnected from ordinary human experience. He judged outcomes. Danielle spent her life understanding people. The difference between those two perspectives was about to become very important. Rachel finally opened the folder in her lap. Inside were employee records, performance reviews, customer feedback reports, attendance records. Danielle's file was nearly perfect. Rachel flipped through the pages slowly. "Do you know what bothers me most?" she asked. Danielle looked up. Rachel pointed to several reports. "In 4 years, you have received more positive customer comments than anyone else on staff." Danielle laughed softly. "People are usually very kind." Rachel shook her head. "No. They are kind because you are kind first." Before Danielle could respond, another employee stepped into the room. His name was Marcus, one of the kitchen supervisors. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Rachel nodded. Marcus looked disappointed. "She stayed 3 hours after her shift ended last month helping us during that equipment failure." Another employee appeared behind him. Then another. Within minutes, several co-workers had gathered nearby. None of them were discussing the water spill anymore. Instead, they were sharing stories. Small stories. Quiet stories. Moments when Danielle had helped someone without being asked. Covered a shift. Brought food to a sick coworker. Helped train new employees. The stories accumulated one after another. Danielle listened with visible embarrassment. She never liked attention. Yet something unusual was happening. While Victor's judgment was spreading through the dining room, Danielle's reputation was spreading through the staff. Two completely different pictures of the same woman were beginning to emerge. One defined by a 5-second mistake. The other defined by years of character. And before the night ended, those two pictures would collide in front of everyone inside the restaurant. The employee locker room gradually emptied as co-workers returned to their stations, but the weight of the evening remained. Danielle Brooks sat quietly for another minute before standing and smoothing the wrinkles from her uniform. Her shift was not technically over yet, but everyone understood what was coming. Rachel Foster remained beside her, still searching for a solution that seemed increasingly out of reach. Outside, the restaurant continued operating, though the energy had changed completely. The laughter that had filled the charity event earlier had faded. Conversations were quieter now, more thoughtful. Guests kept glancing toward the service corridor, wondering what would happen next. In the dining room, Victor Caldwell finished a conversation with several investors. Yet even he could sense the unusual atmosphere surrounding the situation. People were no longer discussing business deals or charitable donations. They were discussing the waitress. A waitress he believed had simply failed to meet expectations. Near the back of the restaurant, an elderly customer named Thomas Reed slowly rose from his table. He had been dining at the restaurant for years. Many employees knew him well. He approached Rachel near the service entrance. "Is Danielle leaving?" he asked. Rachel hesitated before answering. "It appears that way." Thomas frowned deeply. "That would be a mistake." Rachel looked surprised. Thomas rarely involved himself in staff matters. The older man glanced around before lowering his voice. "3 winters ago, my wife slipped on ice and spent months recovering. Danielle checked on us every week." Rachel listened quietly. Thomas continued. "She would package soup for us to take home. Sometimes she paid for dessert herself and never mentioned it." Rachel felt her throat tighten. Another guest nearby overheard the conversation. A woman named Linda Carter stepped forward. "She did something similar for my father," she said. Within minutes, more stories began surfacing among customers. None of them had planned to speak. Yet one memory led to another. A birthday celebration Danielle helped organize when a family was struggling financially. A forgotten wallet she personally returned. An elderly guest she escorted safely to a waiting car during a snowstorm. One by one, people shared moments that had never appeared in any employee file. Small acts of kindness, quiet gestures, ordinary examples of extraordinary character. The irony became impossible to ignore. The longer people talked about Danielle, the less anyone discussed the mistake. Meanwhile, Danielle herself knew nothing about the growing conversation taking place beyond the service doors. She stood in front of her locker, carefully removing personal belongings. A family photograph, a small notebook, a transit pass. The routine felt strangely normal despite the circumstances. Rachel entered carrying a small envelope. Danielle immediately understood what it contained. The final paperwork. Rachel looked heartbroken. "I am sorry," she whispered. Danielle accepted the envelope without complaint. She studied it briefly before placing it inside her bag. No anger crossed her face. No bitterness entered her voice. That calmness only made the situation feel more painful for everyone watching. Rachel finally asked the question she had been carrying all evening. "How are you staying so composed?" Danielle thought for a moment. Then she smiled gently. "Because one difficult moment does not get to decide who I am." Rachel lowered her eyes. The words lingered in the quiet room. Neither woman realized that before the night ended, those words would become the foundation for something much bigger. Because out in the dining room, the guests were beginning to see a version of Danielle that no performance review could fully capture. And soon, the entire restaurant would be forced to choose which mattered more, a 5-second mistake or a lifetime of character. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the evening moved toward an outcome nobody felt comfortable accepting. Danielle Brooks zipped her bag, slipped the strap over her shoulder, and took one final look around the employee area. For years of memories lived inside those walls. Early morning shifts, holiday rushes, celebrations with coworkers, quiet moments after closing. Yet she did not linger. Some chapters ended whether people were ready or not. Rachel Foster walked beside her as they headed toward the dining room. Neither woman spoke. The silence between them carried too much emotion for words. When the swinging doors opened, the atmosphere on the other side felt completely different from the one Danielle had left earlier. The restaurant was still full, but almost nobody seemed focused on their meals anymore. Guests looked up as she appeared. Conversations softened. Silverware paused in midair. Even the piano music felt distant. Beneath the weight of expectations spreading through the room, Danielle noticed the attention immediately. It made her uncomfortable. She had never wanted to become the center of a story. She simply wanted to do her job and go home. Yet tonight had taken a direction nobody could have predicted. Across the dining room, Victor Caldwell remained seated at his table. He noticed Danielle emerge from the service corridor carrying her bag. For the first time that evening, a faint uncertainty entered his expression. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The confidence he had displayed earlier no longer seemed quite as absolute. Rachel escorted Danielle toward the front of the restaurant where several employees had quietly gathered. Marcus stood nearby. Other servers lingered close to the service station. Their faces reflected sadness more than anger. Danielle smiled at them. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." A few employees lowered their eyes. One young server looked as though she might cry. Thomas Reed, the elderly customer, slowly rose from his table once more. "Before you leave," he said, his voice carrying gently across the room, "I think people should have a chance to say goodbye properly." Several guests nodded in agreement. Danielle looked surprised. Rachel glanced around and realized something remarkable was happening. The room no longer belonged to Victor's decision. It belonged to the people affected by it. One by one, customers offered brief words of appreciation. A woman thanked Danielle for always remembering her father's dietary restrictions. Another guest spoke about the kindness she showed during a difficult family gathering. The stories continued. Small moments, quiet moments, human moments. Danielle listened with growing embarrassment. She never knew most people remembered those things. Through it all, Victor remained silent. The accumulation of stories seemed to challenge the simple narrative he had created earlier. Each memory added another layer to a person he had judged within seconds. Finally, the room grew still once more. The stories ended. The guests settled back into silence. Danielle adjusted the strap on her bag and prepared to leave. Then someone near the back of the dining room spoke. "Do you want to say anything before you go?" The question floated through the air. Every head turned toward Danielle. Rachel looked at her. The employees looked at her. Even Victor's eyes remained fixed on her face. The room expected disappointment. Some expected anger. Others expected sadness. Danielle stood quietly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers and took a slow breath. For a moment, she simply looked around at everyone gathered there. Then a calm expression settled across her face. And when she finally opened her mouth to speak, nobody in the restaurant could have imagined how deeply her words were about to change the entire room. The restaurant became so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than before. Every eye remained fixed on Danielle Brooks. Guests leaned forward in their seats. Employees stood motionless near the service stations. Rachel Foster clasped her hands together nervously. Even Victor Caldwell, who had spent most of the evening speaking with certainty, now watched in complete silence. Danielle looked around the room one last time. She recognized many faces. Some were regular customers. Some were coworkers. Some were strangers she would probably never see again. Yet in that moment, they all shared the same expectation. They were waiting to hear what she would say. Danielle adjusted the strap on her bag and smiled softly. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, no desire to embarrass anyone. The calmness in her face immediately captured the room's attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle enough that people instinctively leaned closer to listen. "I have been thinking about something while standing back there," she said. Nobody moved. Danielle continued. "The easiest thing in the world is to judge someone during their worst 5 seconds." The words floated through the room and settled over every table. Several guests exchanged glances. Victor's expression tightened slightly. Danielle paused before continuing. "The hardest thing is remembering they may have spent years being kind before that moment." Silence. Complete silence. It felt as though time itself had stopped moving. Danielle was not speaking loudly. She did not need to. Every person in the restaurant heard her perfectly. The words carried a weight that no raised voice ever could. She looked down briefly before lifting her eyes again. "All of us have moments we wish we could take back," she said. "A mistake, a misunderstanding, a bad day, a few seconds that do not represent who we really are." Several employees lowered their heads. Others stared at the floor. The message was reaching far beyond the situation that had started the evening. Danielle continued. "I think most people hope to be remembered for the years they spent trying to do the right thing, not for the few seconds when they got something wrong." Thomas Reed slowly sat down in his chair, visibly emotional. A woman near the front wiped moisture from her eyes. Across the room, Victor felt an unfamiliar discomfort settling in his chest. It was not anger. It was recognition. For the first time all evening, he was being forced to examine the situation from outside his own perspective. Danielle smiled gently. I am not upset with anyone. That statement surprised almost everyone present. She looked toward Victor briefly. Not with accusation. Not with resentment. Simply with honesty. Life has taught me that people often carry burdens we cannot see. The billionaire lowered his gaze. Danielle continued. Sometimes kindness is easier when we remember that. The room remained perfectly still. No one interrupted. No one whispered. The restaurant had become a classroom without anyone realizing it. A lesson was unfolding, and nobody wanted to miss a word. Danielle finally took a slow breath. So if tonight becomes the last shift I ever work here, I hope people remember something important. She looked around the dining room one final time. A person's character is usually hidden inside all the ordinary days nobody notices, not inside their worst moment. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before. It was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective, thoughtful, transformative. And as Danielle took a small step toward the exit, she had no idea that the people in the room were already beginning to see her very differently than they had only a few minutes earlier. For several long seconds after Danielle Brooks finished speaking, nobody in the restaurant moved. The silence felt almost sacred. Her words lingered in the air, settling into the thoughts of every person present. Guests stared down at their tables. Employees stood motionless. Even the soft piano music seemed distant beneath the weight of reflection spreading through the room. Danielle adjusted her bag and turned slightly toward the exit. She had said everything she needed to say. She expected nothing in return. Not applause. Not sympathy. Not a second chance. The lesson had never been about saving her job. It had been about preserving her dignity. Before she could take another step, a voice broke the silence. She is right. The words came from Thomas Reed. The elderly customer slowly stood from his chair and faced the room. His eyes moved from table to table before settling briefly on Victor Caldwell. I have known Danielle for years, he said. Not because she served my meals. Because she treated people like they mattered. Several guests nodded immediately. Thomas continued. When my wife was recovering, she showed us kindness during one of the hardest periods of our lives. She never asked for recognition. She never expected anything in return. A woman near the front spoke next. She did the same for my family. Another guest raised a hand. And mine. Suddenly the room came alive with stories. One after another, customers began sharing memories. Danielle listened in stunned silence. She had forgotten many of the moments people described. Helping someone carry groceries to a car. Staying late to comfort a grieving customer. Covering the cost of a meal when a family was struggling. None of those actions had seemed important at the time. Yet now they returned one by one, forming a picture that no performance review could ever capture. Rachel Foster wiped away a tear. Marcus smiled proudly from across the room. The stories continued. With each one, the contrast grew sharper. A 5-second mistake on one side. Years of character on the other. Across the dining room, Victor sat perfectly still. For the first time all evening, he was no longer hearing opinions. He was hearing evidence. Real people. Real experiences. Real lives touched by someone he had dismissed in seconds. The realization was uncomfortable because it exposed something deeper than a poor decision. It exposed a habit. A habit of judging quickly. A habit of valuing performance over humanity. Victor looked around the room and noticed something he had not expected. Nobody was talking about the spilled water anymore. Not one person. The incident that had seemed so important earlier now felt insignificant compared to everything being revealed. Danielle remained near the entrance, her expression humble and slightly overwhelmed. She never interrupted the stories. She never corrected anyone. She simply listened. Then Victor slowly rose from his chair. The movement immediately quieted the room. Every eye turned toward him. The billionaire looked very different from the man who had stood up earlier in anger. The confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Regret. He looked at Danielle for a long moment before speaking. And when he finally opened his mouth, everyone in the restaurant understood that the evening was about to change once again. Victor Caldwell remained standing as silence settled over the restaurant once again. For a moment, he seemed to search for words that had always come easily before. Yet this time was different. Business negotiations had never prepared him for a room full of people quietly revealing the limits of his own judgment. He looked around at the guests who had shared their stories. He looked at the employees who respected Danielle Brooks. Finally, he looked directly at her. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but their impact moved through the room immediately. Nobody had expected them. Victor took a slow breath. Tonight, I believed I was defending standards. What I was really doing was judging a person without understanding who she was. Danielle listened quietly. The restaurant remained completely still. Victor continued. "I saw a mistake. Everyone else saw a human being." Rachel Foster lowered her eyes. Thomas Reed smiled faintly. The billionaire glanced toward the document folder that had started everything. The folder still sat on the table, dry, undamaged. Suddenly, it looked absurdly unimportant compared to the lesson unfolding around it. Victor stepped forward. "For years I have told people that character matters. Tonight I realized I was measuring character by performance instead of by actions." He paused before speaking again. "And that was my failure." The honesty in his voice surprised even him. Danielle stood calmly near the entrance, her bag still resting on her shoulder. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only quiet understanding. Victor looked at her. "I would like to apologize to you publicly." The room remained silent. Not because people disagreed with me. Not because this became uncomfortable. Because what I did was unfair. Several guests nodded. Victor continued. "I reduced years of integrity to a few seconds of imperfection." Danielle smiled gently. "Thank you for saying that." Her response contained no bitterness, no attempt to make him feel worse. That grace somehow made the moment even more powerful. Victor took another breath. "If you are willing, I would like you to keep your position here." Rachel immediately looked up. Several employees exchanged hopeful glances. Yet Danielle remained thoughtful. She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked around the restaurant one final time. She saw co-workers who had supported her, customers who had spoken for her, people who had chosen compassion over convenience. Then she looked back at Victor. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "But the most important thing already happened." Victor frowned slightly. Danielle smiled. People remembered that a person is more than their worst moment. The words settled gently across the room. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody wanted to interrupt. For the first time all evening, the tension was completely gone. In its place remained something warmer. Understanding, respect, reflection. A few minutes later, guests slowly returned to their tables. Conversations resumed. The piano music seemed brighter than before. Danielle walked toward the exit beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers. As she reached the door, she glanced back briefly. Rachel was smiling through tears. Thomas raised a hand in farewell. Even Victor stood quietly, watching her leave with a level of respect he had not possessed when the evening began. Danielle stepped outside into the cool Chicago night. The city lights reflected across the sidewalk as a gentle breeze moved through the streets. Behind her, the restaurant continued its evening. Ahead of her, life continued as well. She walked forward carrying the same kindness she had always carried. And inside the restaurant, long after she disappeared from view, people remained thoughtful, because they had witnessed something money could not buy, power could not demand, and status could not create. They had witnessed the quiet strength of a person whose character proved greater than a mistake, and the lasting power of a room willing to learn the difference.
Everything is going to be all right. We are right here with you, whatever happens.